There's a new protocol being used for distributed denial of service.
Hey Jim, what's the story you have for us today?
Yeah, this was an interesting one that I came across this week. Over the years on the show, we've talked about a lot of reflective DDoS attacks using various UDP stuff. The first ones were probably the DNS and the NTP, but we've also had the SSDP. Well, I happened across an article this week on one using WSD, Web Services Discovery, which is UDP port 3702. And it's basically a SOAP over UDP. So it's got these structured queries that they're doing in UDP packets, and you send a relatively small query, get a large response. Since it's UDP, it can be spoofed, and so this has been turned into another reflective DDoS vector. But what I thought was interesting about this is another case where this particular protocol isn't as widespread as as some of the other ones we've talked about, as NTP and DNS and SSDP and things like that. But it is found in printers, webcams, online, DVR type appliances. Obviously, all things that shouldn't be exposed to the internet. And the one article I was looking at, the ZDNet one, said that they became aware of that it was being used for DDoS in the May time frame. So I went and took a look at our data just to see what I could see. And what I discovered is it looks like it may have been discovered back in December of last year. If you take a look at the graph here of the flows, I'm showing 365 days. And you'll see there's, a little baseline there. And then there's a spike sometime around Christmas of last year. And then another little spike in January. And then it started ramping up slowly. And then all of a sudden, in the last month or so, a whole lot more of that traffic really ramping up since, say, the middle of August, so maybe the last 6 weeks or so. But I took another look, and I really believe that somebody discovered that it could be used for amplification probably last December. Because when I looked at the bytes per flow, very few until that same spike in late December of last year. And then since then, there has been a fair amount of these spikes. Surprisingly, while the number of flows has increased greatly in the last 6 weeks or so, the number of bytes per flow has actually dropped down considerably. I think some of those flows are scanning to see if they can find the vulnerable systems. And so I think that we're not, while the number of flows goes way up in the last 6 weeks and the number of DDoSes, I'm sure, has increased in the 6 weeks, I think a fair amount of this may be scanning to find the vulnerable devices and not just the DDoSs themselves. I guess one of the things that always, whenever I see these UDP used for distributed denial of service, is A, what are those devices doing directly connected to the internet? None of these devices, none of your printers, your webcams, your DVRs, none of those need to be directly connected to the internet. And two, what are the ISPs doing as far as egress filtering so that, you know, the spoofed traffic isn't allowed to exit the local networks onto the internet in the first place?
I know one of the challenges for some of that egress filtering might be if like the ISP has a lot of IP space, that the adversary can still spoof quite a bit of IP address space, but at least they'll be localized. So it's still important to do things like that.
Yeah, well, and it really is incumbent on the, you know, on the edge nodes, you know, the edge networks, to be filtering at their egress, because once it's gotten past the edge network, you know, it's not something that we can do, you know, as a big network service provider, because we're connecting lots and lots of networks. You know, we have to rely on them to do the filtering when they're exiting their network onto our backbone. But the edge networks, you know, the leaf nodes, if you will, are the ones that really need to be watching their egress and trying to filter that. Because you're right, once it's onto the ISP's network, they've got so much space and so many different networks that you could still have a lot of significant DDoS traffic just within that one space.
Another thing that you said that kind of resonated with me is with that first spike of being around Christmas time of last year, which I think we've seen before, definitely heard before. A lot of this type of DDoS is related to like maybe gaming activity, and a lot of people who like to do gaming also go to maybe school and they have a break for Christmas time. And this is where they get to experiment with some of these tactics or some of these new techniques, especially something like this, like it's a new port that maybe somebody's discovered, and then they try it out and they scan in and like, oh wow, this works.
And I think that's what that spike was. I think that spike was the initial discovery, and then playing around and seeing how much amplification they could get, and then the actual DDoSs didn't start for some months yet after that.
Yes, and then building it up, and then others adopting it and kind of hearing about it and then using it within their toolkits. And then you kind of see those other bigger spikes where all of a sudden others are scanning for it now and maybe trying to utilize the technique.
Any devices that you own, printers, security cameras, you know, things that are not computers, but ultimately have computers, make sure they're not accessible on the internet. So a lot of the time when you buy a new security camera and you're setting it up on your network, you want to do your due diligence and make sure that if you're sitting outside of your network, you can't talk to it. Because if you can talk to it and it's running the service, somebody can actually go in and turn that into a bot.